From the high walls of the dragon pit, where broken arches and shattered pillars spoke of grander days long past, the gathered forces dispersed into tense murmurs. Daenerys Targaryen stood with Jon at the center of the ancient ruin, the caged white still snapping at the bars behind them. The demonstration had been an unqualified success in one sense. No one present could doubt the menace of the undead after seeing that horrific, snarling creature. Yet a bitter taste lingered, for Cersei Lannister's swift acquiescence felt more like a performance than a genuine commitment. Tyrion Lannister, who had hovered near the back of the meeting with watchful eyes, let out a long breath when he saw his sister exit under heavy guard. The hush of the aftermath pressed on him, turning his mind to 1,000 questions. Would Cersei truly send Lannister banners to the north? Would she instead plot a betrayal the moment the northern armies and Daenerys' legions were committed against the White Walkers? And what of Jaime? Tyrion caught a glimpse of his brother's face as he followed Cersei away, hard, conflicted, older than Tyrion remembered. Jon Targaryen wore an expression of guarded hope, scanning the departing Lannisters and the uneasy soldiers who had remained behind. At his side, Arthur Dayne rested one hand on the pommel of Dawn, the pale blade that had so often shone under desert suns and northern snows. Dayne's gaze flicked between Lannister crossbowmen in the distant stands, Scorpion artillery perched menacingly above, and the hard line of Cersei's retreating shoulders. He was no stranger to courtly maneuvers or false promises. He whispered to Jon, "We should plan for treachery, Your Grace." Jon let out a tired breath. "You, Tyrion, everyone keeps warning me about Cersei's duplicity. We'll be prepared. But there's no turning back. If we can gather even a fraction of her strength to stand against the dead, it might save countless lives." Arthur nodded gravely. "Agreed, but let us not blind ourselves. The realm has often been undone by false alliances." Daenerys, overhearing, turned. Grief still clung to her like a shroud. The memory of Viserion's death weighed heavily on every breath she took. She met Arthur's gaze, then Jon's. "We press on. If Cersei truly joins us, good. If not, we fight without her. Either way, the undead aren't waiting." Jon offered her the barest flicker of a consoling smile. "We'll gather our own allies. The North, the Riverlands, Dorne if they can rally, and your armies. We can't rely on King's Landing alone." She nodded, lips tightening. "Then we depart as soon as we can. My men can camp outside the city while we finalize whatever formalities remain. If Cersei cooperates at all, that means the use of the Rose Road for troop movements. If not, we may need to sail north again from Dragonstone." Nearby, the caged white frothed and hissed, rattling its prison. Tyrion stepped forward, eyeing the thing with disgust. "We should keep it under guard until we decide what next. The damned creature's proven its point, but letting it loose again would be folly." Jon signaled to Unsullied, who carefully shoved the cage shut. "We'll keep it locked," Jon replied. "If Cersei wants to examine it further, she can do so in the presence of our best fighters." Arthur Dayne, brow furrowed, asked quietly, "What if she demands it destroyed as a token of good faith? The men who have seen it are enough to spread the tale, but perhaps she might fear we'd use it again against her in some twisted way." Daenerys considered the question, then shook her head. "I doubt she'll press the issue. She's had her shock. But if she does, we'll yield. We've accomplished what we came to do." Soon, under the watchful eyes of the Lannister guards, Daenerys and her entourage led the caged white out of the dragon pit. Drogon and Regal soared high above the city, their passing shadows making the crowds below cry out in alarm. Even after the demonstration, King's Landing had not grown used to the roar of living dragons overhead. Small folk clutched children to their chests, street vendors hid behind carts, and whispers spread like wildfire. "The Targaryens are here. The dead walk. The world is ending." Despite the tension, Daenerys' presence near the city walls was carefully negotiated that afternoon. Cersei allowed her armies to camp beyond the gates, so long as they did not attempt to enter King's Landing in large numbers. Tyrion, mindful of all they had to lose, agreed. The Unsullied formed their disciplined ranks along the main roads, The Dothraki pitched tents and lit fires, cooking horse meat and spicing the air with foreign scents. Northern soldiers, a smaller contingent, set up near the Targaryen banners, quietly watching their exotic allies. Daenerys herself arranged a large pavilion for strategy meetings, with the battered Targaryen sigil snapping in the wind. That evening, Jaime Lannister arrived unexpectedly, escorted by a handful of men. He requested an audience with Daenerys, with Jon, and with Tyrion. Arthur Dayne stood guard at the tent flaps, scanning Jaime's retinue. Jaime's face was a study in tension as he entered, golden hand glinting in the torchlight, the weight of regret pulling at his features. Tyrion, arms folded, waited to see if Jaime would speak first. The older brother cleared his throat. "I've come on behalf of Cersei. She confirms that the crown will support this truce. We'll dispatch a portion of our armies north by the King's Road as soon as they can be mobilized." He seemed to swallow a lump. "She also insists that if we are victorious over the undead, the realm will remember House Lannister's loyalty, and that the Targaryens will not seize King's Landing by force." Daenerys regarded Jaime with cool composure. "I cannot speak for the entire future. If we are forced to endure further treachery, we will react accordingly. But if the Lannisters stand beside us in this war, I will not forget it." She glanced at Jon, who nodded in agreement. Jaime hesitated, steeling himself. "She wants the same from you, Snow, if I should call you Targaryen now, that your northern bannermen and their Targaryen king will not harass Lannister lands while we fight side by side." Jon took a measured breath. "I have no desire for southern conquests. My only priority is stopping the dead." A flicker of relief passed through Jaime's eyes, though it was tainted by cynicism. "Then it seems we have an understanding." He paused, gaze drifting to Arthur Dayne. "I never thought I would see you again, Sir Arthur." His voice tightened, memories of a blood-stained throne room and a mad king swirling behind his eyes. "I was told you died at the Tower of Joy." Arthur inclined his head, features schooled to neutrality. "I nearly did, and you were a young man when I saw you last, Jaime. Now the realm depends on all of us, no matter what we once were." Jaime exhaled, a ghost of shame flickering across his face. "If half the stories are true, we'll need every sword. My father always said you were the finest knight in the realm. I'm glad you're here now for the realm's sake." He turned stiffly, not wanting to betray more emotion. "I must return to the Red Keep tonight. The city is uneasy." Before Jaime left, Tyrion stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Brother, is she genuine? Has Cersei truly agreed to this?" Jaime's expression flinched. "She told me so herself, but you know how she is, Tyrion. She'll scheme for advantage. If she can send a token force north while holding the bulk of her army back, she might do it. We'll see." He squeezed Tyrion's shoulder briefly, then brushed past him and left the tent, men in tow. Daenerys, watching him depart, realized her entire plan. Indeed, the realm's fate rested on a vow from a queen infamous for treachery. The strangeness of it all weighed on her. She had come to conquer, but instead she was forging a fragile alliance with the very house that had dethroned her father. Nearby, Jon looked equally unsettled. They locked eyes, each reading the other's doubts. Yet neither voiced them aloud, for the alternative was unthinkable. A war in the south while the Night King advanced in the north. That night, as the moon rose over the spires of King's Landing, a damp wind blew from Blackwater Bay. Within the Targaryen pavilion, Arthur Dayne stood a silent watch while Jon and Daenerys conferred with their close advisors, Tyrion, Missandei, Grey Worm, and a handful of northern bannermen who had traveled south. Candle flames danced in the drafty interior, illuminating the lines of fatigue on everyone's faces. Tyrion gestured to a map spread across a low table. "Even if the crown truly marches, we're talking about a few moons at least before a sizable Lannister host can reach the neck, let alone the north. The roads are poor, and winter creeps south. If we wait for them, the White Walkers may already be upon us." Jon tapped the stylized outline of the neck. "We can't wait too long. The Night's Watch sends ravens almost daily about undead activity beyond the wall. The free folk are pulling back, preparing for a siege of the wall itself if the dead swarm. We have to move as soon as possible to bolster the wall's defenses. Daenerys frowned, a flash of sorrow crossing her features. Drogon and Regal have flown long distances these past weeks. Regal still mourns Viserion. He's restless, unpredictable. I need to be certain of his strength before I commit them to a major battle. But if the wall is where we must fight, I'll bring them, no matter the risk. Grey Worm, arms folded behind his back in the disciplined stance of an unsullied commander, nodded. We can sail your troops to White Harbor again, then march overland. It's still faster than taking the roads from here, especially for the Dothraki, who can ride north if they wish. But many ships will be needed. Tyrion gave a grim half-smile, which means we will rely on the Red Keep's goodwill to allow our ships to dock unmolested. Or we could go back to Dragonstone and gather what remains of our fleet. Euron Greyjoy still prowls the seas, though. Daenerys' jaw clenched at the mention of Euron. That twisted crow of the Iron Islands had pledged himself to Cersei, bringing with him a brutal navy. If Euron remains loyal to Cersei, we risk attacks on our transports. We'll need an escort, but we have little choice. We cannot remain idle in King's Landing waiting for the apocalypse. Jon let out a slow breath. Then we divide our forces. Those best served by traveling by land can do so. The rest come by ship, guided by your fleet. We converge on Winterfell as quickly as possible. Whether or not the Lannisters join us in time, that's up to them. Tyrion nodded, glancing around the circle of tense faces. It seems we have a plan or the beginnings of one. Let us hope it's enough. Arthur Dayne spoke for the first time that evening, his voice low yet resonant. The realm has rarely stood so precariously. If we fail to unite, we face oblivion. But I have faith in your graces. He included both Daenerys and Jon in his gaze. Let us proceed without hesitation. They dispersed to rest for what few hours remained of the night. The next morning, Daenerys sent word to the Red Keep, informing Cersei of her departure and inviting her to send an advance force north immediately if she so wished. The Raven carried polite phrases about the dire threat, the ongoing truce, and Daenerys' intention to sail. Then she and Jon prepared to pull up camp. The caged wight, no longer needed in King's Landing, was hauled onto a wagon to travel north. Though the demonstration was over, they feared losing so potent a piece of evidence if things soured again. Within 2 days, the Targaryen-led force packed their tents, loaded supplies onto ships, and departed from the nearby ports at the mouth of the Blackwater. Daenerys flew overhead with Drogon and Regal to keep watch for Euron's fleet, while Tyrion and Grey Worm orchestrated the loading of men, horses, and siege equipment. Jon's northern soldiers boarded several cogs, uneasy about sea travel. Arthur Dayne helped maintain order, his calm presence guiding men too anxious to climb onto unfamiliar decks. A handful of Dothraki Khalasars elected to ride overland, reasoning that they trusted their horses more than wooden ships. They would follow the King's Road north, skirting past Harrenhal and the Trident. Some northern bannermen also chose to ride the roads, preferring firm ground. Jon entrusted a few of his best trackers to lead them, warning them to avoid any Lannister entanglements. With luck, they would reach the neck around the same time the ships arrived at White Harbor. Thus began a second great voyage for Daenerys' combined forces, heading back to the cold that waited in the northern latitudes. The sea was not friendly, though the storms were mild compared to some. Days of endless gray water and bitter wind wore on the men. The caged wight moaned below decks, unnerving the sailors who refused to sleep near it. Yet no sightings of Euron's fleet came, and after nearly a fortnight, the coastline shifted, revealing the headlands near White Harbor. A heavy snow began to fall just as the ships glided into the port. Lord Wyman Manderly's banners flapped in the frigid breeze, and watchfires burned on the piers to guide the battered flotilla in. Once ashore, Daenerys, Jon, and their allies regrouped. The columns of Unsullied once more took formation, disciplined as ever, though they had grown used to the north's chill. The Dothraki who had come by ship disembarked with wary eyes, scanning the snowy streets. A few northern houses, grateful for new allies, offered what provisions they could spare, though winter's approach had already cut into their stores. Daenerys could not help but recall the day she first arrived in White Harbor, when the notion of capturing a white and forging a truce with Cersei was still an uncertain dream. Now they returned with a partial success, carrying the deep wound of Viserion's death and the bruising knowledge that the war for the Dawn was imminent. Her heart remained heavy, but an undercurrent of fierce resolve sparked inside her. She would not lose another dragon without extracting a deadly price from the Night King and his minions. Jon noticed her pensive mood as they rode side by side from the docks toward Manderly's keep. "We'll keep pushing," he said softly, voice muffled by the swirl of snow. "We have to." She nodded, set her jaw. "Yes, we do." When they entered the courtyard of Manderly's keep, they found Wyman Manderly himself waiting with a retinue of knights and sworn swords. The plump lord offered them a respectful bow, though his eyes shone with worry. "Your graces, we receive more ravens by the day. Skirmishes beyond the wall. Tormund's men reported that the undead grow bolder. The watch is preparing for a siege at Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower. They need reinforcements." Jon dismounted, rubbing cold stiffened fingers together. "Then we waste no time. We'll gather here for a day or two, just long enough to rest and let stragglers arrive. Then we march on Winterfell. From there, we'll send men to the wall." Daenerys's breath crystallized in the frigid air as she pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "I'll take the dragons to Winterfell immediately. We can move them to the wall whenever necessary. I want them rested and ready." Wyman Manderly's triple chin bobbed as he nodded. "We've done our best to bolster supplies, but with so many mouths to feed, we'll need to consider rationing. The king in the north, if I may call you that, your grace, knows the strain of provisioning such large armies here in the cold season. We'll manage, but it's going to be tight." Jon forced a grim smile. "Thank you, my lord. Do what you must. We'll ensure our men cause as little burden as possible. This is about survival now, not comfort." That night, the keep rang with the bustle of renewed war preparations. Armorers worked by lamplight, hammering out breastplates for men who once wore only furs. Seamstresses sewed thick quilts, linen wrappings, anything to stave off the lethal chill. Daenerys hosted a small war council in Manderly's audience chamber, featuring Tyrion, Grey Worm, and the northern lords who had traveled with them. Jon sat at her side, with Arthur Dayne standing watch near the door. Maps of the north lay stretched across a wide table, weighed at the corners by heavy candlesticks. Tyrion traced his finger along the route from White Harbor to Winterfell. "We can make the journey in under a week if conditions hold. The real question is whether we move from Winterfell to the wall or stay put to build a strong defense line there." Jon glanced at the map, at the ragged boundary of the gift and the looming wall. "The best place to hold is the wall itself if we can. But if the dead break through the wall, the open fields between the gift and Winterfell will be a killing ground. The plan might be to station a strong force at Winterfell while reinforcing the watch. If the dead breach the wall, we give them battle somewhere with more fortifications." Daenerys's voice was measured but held an edge of urgency. "I've lost one dragon to the White Walkers, and I will not lose another carelessly. Yet I also know the dragons are our best weapon against the undead hordes. We must use them where it counts most. If the wall can hold until I arrive by air, then we stand a chance to annihilate a major portion of the army of the dead. Fire is our greatest ally here." The idea of a pitched battle on the icy battlements of the wall, with dragons soaring overhead, lit the imagination of every person in the room. Some wore expressions of excitement or awe at the possibility of such a spectacle. Others, like Jon, felt only cold dread. Tyrion cleared his throat. "One question remains. If the Night King can kill a dragon, can he do more? How did he do it the first time?" Jon rubbed at his temples, tension knotting in his neck. "He used a spear of ice or the White Walker equivalent. It struck Viserion's side, and we lost him. But the Night King himself was rumored to be more powerful than the typical walker. We must assume he can replicate that feat." A weighted silence settled over the gathering. Finally, Grey Worm spoke in his quiet, precise manner. "Then we must use the dragons carefully. Lure the Night King into a position where you strike from behind or above. If he can be destroyed, perhaps the rest will fall." Daenerys inhaled slowly. "Perhaps. Rhaegal and Drogon respond to me, but I cannot promise we'll get close enough for a sure kill. We'll see what the battlefield offers." They discussed possible strategies well into the night, how to coordinate the arrival of reinforcements, the best ways to quickly dispatch whites using fire or dragonglass, and the question of whether the Lannisters would ever arrive. Tyrion pointed out that if a single Lannister banner marched into the north, it might serve to reassure Daenerys and Jon that Cersei's promise wasn't a ruse. Yet none had received word of any Lannister contingents nearing Moat Cailin or crossing the Neck. Before dawn, the council ended. Daenerys, exhausted, retired to a modest chamber provided by Manderly's household. Jon and Arthur Dayne returned to their own rooms, though they found little comfort in the lumpy straw mattresses and the howling wind outside. The next day, the armies departed again from White Harbor, forging the final leg of their journey to Winterfell. As they advanced inland, the cold deepened. Snow swirled in near blizzards at times, forcing the columns to halt. Scouts reported frozen streams and half-buried roads. But the hardened Unsullied pressed on without complaint, and the Dothraki accepted the discomfort with stoic, if reluctant, determination. At least they had open land to gallop through, even if it was blanketed in snow. Daenerys flew overhead often, sending Rhaegal to scout. The black silhouette of Drogon flapping against a gray sky became a familiar sight, a harbinger of Targaryen might brought north. At last, Winterfell rose on the horizon, its walls partly restored after the Bolton depredations. Smoke curled from the tower's chimneys, and men manned the battlements. Jon felt a strange mix of relief and grief every time he saw those ramparts. So many memories bound him to this place. Eddard Stark's quiet presence, Robb's laughter, Arya's fierce tomboy grin, Sansa's songs, even little Bran's scampering in the courtyards. Most of them were gone now, scattered or dead. Only ghosts lingered. Winterfell still stood, a testament to the resilience of the North, but it felt emptier than before. They entered the gates in a swirl of activity. Men inside rushed to greet them, some crying out with excitement at the sight of dragons overhead, others stepping back in fear. Daenerys led her horse into the courtyard, dismounting with practiced ease. She gazed upon the old keep, the battered but proud architecture. She had been here once already, but it struck her more powerfully this time. This was to be the bulwark of the living, the seat from which they would attempt to save the realm. Ser Davos Seaworth emerged to meet them, face lined with fresh worry. He had arrived earlier, traveling with a group of northern loyalists who straggled in from the Riverlands. "Your Grace," he greeted Jon, voice husky. "Good to see you back safe. And you, Your Grace," he added, turning to Daenerys. Jon clasped his forearm in greeting. "Ser Davos, it's been too long. How's the situation here?" Davos grimaced. "We've done what we can. More wildlings arrived, free folk I should say, though they haven't heard from Tormund in a fortnight. No sign of the Lannisters, if you can believe it. A few small houses from the Riverlands sent word they might come, but we'll see if the snows let them pass. The men are training with dragonglass weapons, but they're not used to fighting such creatures. And Winterfell's food stores are running low. We're rationing carefully." Daenerys glanced around, noticing the tired faces of the garrison. "We'll share what supplies we have from the ships and the caravans. I'll direct Grey Worm to distribute them wisely." Davos nodded gratefully. "Aye, that might keep us going for a time. I'll show you to the Great Hall. Might be the warmest place we've got now." That evening, a more somber gathering took place in Winterfell's familiar Great Hall, the walls lit with torches, the old banners of House Stark and House Targaryen draped side by side. Lyanna Mormont sat at a table near the dais, arms folded, face as grim as any older lord. She gave Daenerys a curt nod, silent acknowledgement of the Queen's earlier display of competence. Maester Wolkan, taking over many of the late Maester Luwin's duties, reported new arrivals. Small groups from House Glover, Serwyn, and Mormont herself had trickled in. The total force at Winterfell's command swelled beyond anything the North had mustered in generations. Yet for all their numbers, the sense of dread was palpable. Jon, seated in Ned Stark's old seat, gazed out over a hall full of uncertain faces. Daenerys sat at his left, her expression set. Arthur Dayne stood behind them, silent sentinel. It was an image that might have seemed impossible just a few years prior. A Targaryen queen and a Targaryen king, both present in Winterfell, forging an alliance for the realm's salvation. Rumors whispered among the men that the two Targaryens had more than just a political bond, that something in their shared sorrow and determination drew them closer, but none dared speak it openly yet. Jon cleared his throat. The hall quieted. My lords, my ladies, and those sworn to House Stark and House Targaryen, our enemy does not rest. The White Walkers gather beyond the wall, preparing to breach it. We must be ready, both here and at the wall. Anyone who cannot fight will remain behind these walls, protected by a garrison. The rest of us will split into two forces. One will reinforce Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower. The other will stay here and prepare for a second line of defense if the wall is lost. Daenerys spoke next, her voice echoing in the hall. My dragons and I will move between these forces as needed. Fire is our greatest weapon against the undead. We must strike quickly and decisively if they breach the wall. I've summoned any loyal bannermen from the south, but so far, the snows make travel perilous. We cannot count on fresh reinforcements. A restless energy filled the hall as men shifted, exchanging uneasy glances. Lyanna Mormont stood, small and fierce. House Mormont will stand with you. We have few men left, but each is worth 10 from the south. Tell us where to go, and we'll fight. A few others murmured agreement. Lord Glover, stiff-necked as ever, glowered but finally sighed. We're with you, too. It's no secret I disliked bringing foreign armies to the north, but we've got no choice. Jon thanked them, relief flickering in his eyes. At least some measure of unity remained, despite the precarious alliances. Yet the question of the Lannisters loomed large. Word had come that no large troop movements were reported south of Moat Cailin. Perhaps they were delayed. Perhaps Cersei had sent only token forces. Perhaps none at all. So the days wore on. Winterfell's courtyards rang with the clash of weapons. Unsullied sparred with Northmen, Dothraki taught riders to shoot arrows from horseback, and the forging of dragonglass arrowheads continued ceaselessly under the watchful eye of skilled blacksmiths. Daenerys roamed the ramparts, cloak whipping in the icy wind, scanning the skies for any sign of ravens carrying dire news. Jon spent hours with the quartermasters, rationing barley and turnips. Sometimes, they met in the godswood, that quiet, ancient place of snow-laden weirwood branches, to share updates and anxieties in private. One dusk, as the pale sun dipped behind Winterfell's walls, Daenerys found Jon beneath the heart tree, where red leaves rustled in a faint breeze. The carved face in the trunk seemed to watch them, old as the north itself. Daenerys stepped carefully through the snow, her boots crunching softly. Jon turned, and she saw lines of weariness etched around his eyes, but also that stubborn determination that refused to yield. He inclined his head in greeting. My queen, she offered a small smile. We've traveled too many leagues and faced too many perils for such formality. Call me Daenerys, at least here. Jon hesitated. As you wish, Daenerys. She looked up at the branches overhead, the last of the sunlight glinting on patches of crimson. I see why the Starks hold this place sacred. There's a sense of timelessness here, even after all the devastation. Jon glanced at the pale bark. This tree has stood for thousands of years, seen kings rise and fall. Now it witnesses two Targaryens at Winterfell. Daenerys turned back to him. You've spoken little of how you feel about that. Once you learned the truth, that you're Rhaegar's son, did you ever imagine you'd return to this place at the head of an army? Or sharing power with another Targaryen? He shook his head slowly, memories drifting through his mind. When Arthur Dayne told me the truth, my world turned upside down. Part of me still thinks of myself as Ned Stark's son, a bastard or not. I never yearned for a throne. I only wanted to do my duty. And now the realm looks to us." She studied his face. "Rhaegar was my brother, though I never knew him. But from what I've heard, you resemble him in more ways than one. His sense of duty, his gentle nature mixed with iron resolve. I often wonder if he foresaw any of this." Jon let out a slow breath, cold air pluming before his lips. If he did, it must have been part of that prophecy he believed in. The prince that was promised. "I'm not sure I believe in such things. I only believe in what we can do here and now." Daenerys stepped closer, searching his eyes. "Then let us do what we must. End this threat. If we survive, well, we can decide what happens next. Whether we rebuild Westeros together, or if one of us claims the throne." Jon gave a weary half-smile. "I only hope we have that choice." They stood in a companionable silence for a moment, a hush broken only by the wind in the weirwood's branches. The possibility of a future beyond war and death hovered between them, fragile and uncertain. Without another word, they turned and left the godswood, returning to the bustle of preparations, each lost in thoughts of what might come. 3 more days passed with no sign of the Lannisters, no word from the south. Then a single raven arrived, bearing Cersei's seal. Tyrion, reading it in Winterfell's great solar, felt dread coil in his gut. It said that a regiment of Lannister infantry, some 2,000 men, had just begun the march north, but the rest would remain behind to guard the capital. Tyrion relayed the contents to Jon and Daenerys, voice dripping with cynicism. "A paltry force. She might claim it's a gesture of goodwill, but 2,000 men is nothing compared to her full army. She's keeping the rest to see if we survive, or perhaps to take advantage of whatever's left after the war." Jon's shoulders sagged. 2,000 is better than none. They might arrive in time to help. If not, it changes nothing about our plan. Daenerys simply nodded, face set like stone. "At least now we know where Cersei stands. She's gambling with our lives, hoping the dead will eliminate her enemies." No further tidings came. Winterfell's war councils continued. The day soon arrived when scouts from the Night's Watch galloped through the gates, half-frozen, bearing dire news. The army of the dead had reached the fist of the first men, scattering any free folk who lingered. Thousands upon thousands of whites were rumored to march under the cloak of endless night. The White Walkers led them, and sightings of a monstrous shape in the sky, something that flew on ragged wings, plunged the watchers into terror. Jon read the scroll with shaking hands. "Something that flies. They must have found Viserion's body." His eyes rose to meet Daenerys's. "The Night King has your dragon. He's reanimated it." Daenerys's face went white, her hand tightening around the arm of her chair until her knuckles showed. "No," she whispered. "Viserion is lost to us." Tyrion cursed under his breath. "Then they have an ice dragon or something akin to it. If it breathes some kind of frost, it could be unstoppable." Silence reigned, stunned and horrified. Arthur Dayne pressed a fist to his chest, remembering the heartbreak of Viserion's death. Now the dragon rose as an undead horror. Missandei covered her mouth, tears glistening at the thought of such a travesty. Grey Worm's calm cracked for just a moment, and he muttered a prayer in low Valyrian. Lyanna Mormont, present at the council, looked grave but resolute. "Then we face 2 living dragons and 1 undead. If we cannot kill that monster, it might bring down the wall." Jon set the letter aside, face grim. "We must assume the dead will use that dragon to breach the wall. We have no time to lose. Daenerys, we have to fly there. Now." She nodded, standing abruptly. "I'll take Drogon and Regal. We'll attempt to protect the wall, or at least evacuate the watch if it's beyond saving. Jon, gather the forces. March north. I'll meet you at Castle Black or wherever the fight is joined." Jon hesitated, a tangle of worry in his chest. "I should come with you. You'll need help." But Daenerys raised a gloved hand. "We cannot risk you or me both being slain at the same time if this fails. Bring the armies north. I'll try to hold them back, but if the wall falls, you have to be prepared to defend Winterfell." If I survive, I'll join you there. If, she faltered, swallowing the words. Jon's expression hardened. If the wall falls and you can't hold them, I understand. Tyrion spoke hurriedly. At least take a small escort, your grace. Arthur Dayne, for instance, might. Daenerys shook her head. He's needed to coordinate the armies with Jon. Drogon can carry only a few men swiftly, and time is everything now. My blood riders and a handful of Unsullied can accompany me if they wish, but the fewer we are, the faster we can fly. She steadied herself, trying to quell the swirl of fear and fury. I will not let my child remain in the Night King's clutches, not without a fight. Moments later, outside the castle gates, she prepared for departure. Rhaegal and Drogon soared in low arcs above the battlements, their roars echoing over the courtyard. Soldiers rushed aside to clear a space. Daenerys, wearing thick leathers lined with fur, clutched the reins on Drogon's harness. Grey Worm approached, half inclined to insist on coming, but she motioned him away. Remain with the army, Grey Worm. You've kept my people safe all these years. I trust you to keep them safe now. He bowed with a fist to his chest, stoic but clearly troubled. Yes, your grace. Jon stood near the gate, wind whipping his cloak. Be careful, he said simply, voice taut, and trust that we will come with all our strength if you need us. She nodded, eyes lingering on him in silent understanding. Then she climbed onto Drogon's flank. Two of her blood riders mounted Rhaegal, though the green dragon shifted restlessly, snarling with inner turmoil. Daenerys murmured words of reassurance in Valyrian, and at last both dragons took flight, buffeting the courtyard with a gale of swirling snow. The watchers shielded their eyes, and the silhouette of Daenerys' figures soared northward, a small wedge of riders behind them, perhaps half a dozen at most. Within minutes, they vanished into the leaden sky. Jon felt a hollow ache in his chest as he watched them go. The last time they faced the White Walkers so directly, they lost Viserion. Now Daenerys risked it all again. He turned to Arthur Dayne, eyes blazing. We prepare the army. If the wall still stands, we'll meet her there. If it falls, we fortify Winterfell and brace for the storm. Arthur bowed, but there was a grin set to his mouth. Then let us see to it. Within hours, ravens flew from Winterfell to every outpost in the north, summoning all able fighters to converge on Castle Black or Winterfell. The courtyards of Winterfell erupted with frantic energy. Men secured supply wagons, blacksmiths hammered out swords of dragonglass-laced steel, and the Dothraki readied their horses for the final, brutal push into the frozen wilderness. The plan was twofold. A portion of the forces would march directly to Castle Black, if the roads permitted, while the remainder would dig in at Winterfell. As the host prepared to move, Tyrion approached Jon, voice subdued. We're gambling that Daenerys and her dragons can hold that monstrous white dragon at bay. But if the Night King has grown even stronger with an undead dragon, I shudder to think of it. Jon's eyes flicked to the gray sky. She's strong, Tyrion, and she has Drogon and Rhaegal by her side. But you're right, no matter how strong, it might not be enough. We must be ready if she fails. Thus, a new dread took hold. The entire north seemed to hold its breath, waiting for word from the wall. Days passed in a swirl of frantic departure. Jon personally led a column north, accompanied by Arthur Dayne, Grey Worm, Tyrion, and Lyanna Mormont, who refused to stay behind. They struggled through snowstorms that slowed their wagons to a crawl. The Dothraki, frustrated by the icy roads, pressed ahead, scouting for safe paths. Unsullied marched in disciplined ranks, silent as tombstones in the swirling snow. A bleak hush covered the land, broken only by the mutter of thousands of boots tramping through drifts. One morning, not far from the last hearth, the seat of House Umber, a rider on a lathered horse appeared on the horizon, galloping toward their vanguard. Alarmed, Jon ordered his men to form up. The rider, an older man of the Night's Watch, slumped in the saddle, breath steaming, eyes wild. He nearly fell into Jon's arms as he dismounted. The wall, the man gasped, eyes brimming with horror. Eastwatch has fallen. The ice, it collapsed. The dragon. It breathed this blue flame, tore a gap in the wall. Tormund and many others, gone. We don't know if they escaped. The army of the dead is coming. They're heading west along the ruins. Castle Black might hold them off for a while, but they're moving, unstoppable. A stunned hush fell over the column. Men paled, some crossing themselves or muttering prayers. Tyrion's face went ashen. Grey Worm gripped his spear, knuckles white. Arthur Dayne closed his eyes a moment, steeling himself. And Jon stared at the rider in mute shock, the enormity of the news slamming into his heart like a hammer. He swallowed, voice barely above a whisper. Daenerys? Was she at East Watch when it fell? The man bowed his head. I didn't see her, M-Lord. Heard dragons overhead. Saw a flash of them fighting the undead one. Couldn't see the outcome. Everything was confusion and ice. I fled as the wall cracked. Jon clenched his fists. He had known it was possible. He had prepared for the worst. But hearing it, the final barrier shattered, left him staggered. The dead were now free to spill into the north. There was no time to gather more forces or flee to safer ground. The battle that once might have been fought at the wall would now be fought closer to Winterfell, if not here and now. And Daenerys' fate was unknown. Lost in the chaos of that cataclysmic battle, Arthur Dayne laid a hand on Jon's shoulder. We must press on. This is what we trained for. Better to meet them in the open fields than to let them surprise us. We'll try to find survivors. Perhaps Daenerys survived. She might already be heading this way. Jon closed his eyes, drawing a shuddering breath. Then he nodded. You're right. We push forward. Tyrion swallowed thickly. If they're heading west from Eastwatch, they'll likely aim for Castle Black or break south around it. The terrain is rough, but if they can breach anywhere, they will. We have to intercept them before they gather too much ground. So the army marched north still, hearts heavy with dread. Snowstorms battered them, and the temperature plummeted. Along the way, they passed scattered groups of frightened small folk, fleeing from remote villages with carts of meager possessions. Jon ordered them escorted south to Winterfell, but some refused to abandon what little they had. Fewer and fewer glimpses of the sun broke the gray gloom overhead. After another punishing week of travel, the combined forces neared the area south of Castle Black, a rugged stretch of land dotted with stunted forests and frozen rivers. Scouts brought back reports of a massive white host moving in this direction. Worse yet, no sign of Daenerys. Jon felt the knot in his gut tighten with each passing day, a litany of silent prayers echoing in his mind. Let her be alive. Let her have escaped. Finally, they encountered a scattered band of survivors from the Night's Watch and the Free Folk. A half-burned torch in hand, Tormund Giantsbane stumbled into camp, half frostbitten, but alive. He collapsed at Jon's feet, hissing in pain. We fought them at Eastwatch. The dragon, gods, Jon. The beast is a horror made of ice and death. Daenerys was there. She and her living dragons tried to hold the breach, but the Night King. They fought in the sky. I don't know the outcome. I saw them vanish behind the swirling storm. Then the wall came crashing down around us. Jon crouched, pressing a hand to Tormund's shoulder. Breathe, Tormund. It's all right. You're safe now. Did you see her fall? Did you see Drogon or Regal come down? Tormund coughed, spitting blood and snow. No, I saw nothing after that final clash. A blizzard swallowed everything. We fled. Eastwatch is overrun. The army of the dead pours in. He gave Jon a desperate look. We have to warn you. The undead might be here any day. Arthur Dayne helped Tormund to a healer's tent. Jon exchanged grim glances with Tyrion and Grey Worm. We set up a defensive line here, Jon said, pointing to the terrain on a map. There's a ridge that might give us some advantage. We dig trenches, place dragonglass stakes. If Daenerys survived, she'll see the fires or the columns from above. So the next 2 days, the Allied forces built a makeshift defensive camp, a ring of trenches studded with sharpened stakes and coated in oil so they could be set ablaze if needed. The Unsullied formed the core, disciplined ranks behind the trenches. The Dothraki cavalry readied their swift horses for flanking maneuvers, though the snow posed a challenge. Northern spearmen, archers, and any wildlings who survived gathered along the ridge. Tyrion helped orchestrate the layout, ensuring that if the undead poured in from multiple angles, they could funnel them into kill zones. The final sunrise before the battle was pale and wan, offering little warmth. Jon stood atop the ridge, scanning the northern horizon. Grey Worm tested the siege weapons, catapults loaded with barrels of burning pitch. Lyanna Mormont led a contingent of her Bear Island men to man the palisade. Tormund, battered but resolute, insisted on fighting, and Arthur Dayne silently roved the lines, offering advice to men on how to handle themselves when faced with unyielding foes that felt no pain. Late that afternoon, the wind picked up, howling across the wasteland. Snow whipped about, stinging eyes. Scouts in the distance suddenly sounded horns. The warning passed along the lines. The dead are coming. Dim shapes emerged from the swirling white, ranks upon ranks of wights shambling forward, some stumbling in the snow, others moving with eerie single-mindedness. The watchers on the ridge gulped in unison, hearts pounding. The horde stretched farther than they could see, a sea of ragged forms, jaws open in silent moans. Here and there, faint glints of armor showed White Walkers commanding them, tall silhouettes in the drifting snow. Jon exhaled, stepping forward in front of the lines. He gripped the hilt of Longclaw. "Archers, prepare!" he shouted over the wind, voice carrying across the anxious hush. "Light your arrows with dragonglass or fire if you have it. Wait for my command." Men scrambled, passing flaming torches, hooking pouches of dragonglass arrowheads. The Dothraki, uneasy about waiting, muttered among themselves. Tyrion moved along the lines, urging discipline. Grey Worm commanded the Unsullied to stand firm. Suddenly, a scream tore through the air, a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The undead lines parted, and there, emerging from the gloom, the shadow of a dragon soared overhead, wings ragged and flesh half-rotted. Blue fire rippled from its jaws, scorching the sky. An unholy chill descended on the battlefield as the white dragon circled, its once cream scales now the color of deathly frost. The Night King, perched on the creature's back, was barely visible through the swirling snow, but his presence exuded dreadful power. Men quailed at the sight, some crying out in terror. Even the fearless Dothraki reined in their horses, wide-eyed. Jon forced the lump from his throat, shouting, "Steady! Stand your ground!" Before the archers could loose a volley, the undead Viserion released a torrent of blue flame that crashed against the trenches below, freezing them solid. The oil-laced timbers and stakes turned brittle under that supernatural cold, fracturing like glass. The carefully laid trap was undone in moments. Whites poured forward with renewed speed, stepping over the broken trenches. The Watchers unleashed arrows, some of which found their marks, felling a portion of the horde. But they just kept coming, a relentless tide. Then, from the southwestern sky, a roar split the heavens. Two dragons appeared, black and green silhouettes twisting through the snow-laden winds. Drogon and Regal. A collective cry of hope rose from the defenders. Daenerys had returned. The living dragons swooped in, unleashing gouts of orange flame that tore into the ranks of the whites, scorching them by the dozens. Jon's heart soared at the sight. She was alive. He could see her perched upon Drogon's back, hair whipped in a frenzy by the wind. Regal roared beside them, vengeful green fire cutting a swath through the undead. For a moment, the lines of the living cheered. Perhaps they could turn this tide. High above, Daenerys guided Drogon in a dive toward the undead Viserion. The twisted corpse of her fallen child shrieked in an unearthly sound, the Night King's eyes gleaming with unnatural light. Blue flame met orange in a fiery collision, ice and fire swirling. The shockwave rippled across the sky, sending gusts that nearly knocked men off their feet. Regal flanked undead Viserion, spewing flames at the creature's flank. For a heartbeat, it seemed the combined might of Drogon and Regal might overpower the abomination. Then the Night King hurled a lance of ice, aimed at Regal's neck. The green dragon barely dodged, roaring in fury. He twisted away, losing altitude. Daenerys seized her chance. Drogon spun around Viserion, snapping at the undead dragon's wings with savage fangs. Black claws raked rotting scales, tearing away chunks of necrotic flesh. Viserion howled in a shrill, pained wail, but it fought back, exhaling blasts of blue flame that brushed Drogon's hide. The black dragon roared in agony, but still pressed the attack, determined to tear Viserion apart. On the ground, the armies clashed. The whites slammed into the unsullied shield wall. Men screamed and steel clashed. Dragonglass-dipped spears found unholy flesh, but for each white that fell, 2 more pressed in. The Dothraki charged, horsemen swirling around the flank, slicing with the rocks, some coated in flaming pitch. The northern archers loosed arrow after arrow. The White Walkers advanced more slowly, using their chilling powers to freeze men in place, to shatter weapons. Arthur Dayne cut down 6 whites in a flurry of pale steel, dawn blazing like a thing of legend. Tyrion huddled behind a line of pikemen, rallying any who wavered. Jon waded into the thick of it, sword blazing with the faint reflection of the fires around him. The stench of decay made him gag, but he pressed on, hacking at skeletal arms and rotten torsos. He bellowed commands, trying to keep the lines from crumbling. As the undead advanced, the living were forced to yield ground, step by bloody step. Above, the dragons fought a more desperate battle. Regal had recovered, circling overhead, but the Night King's throwing arm was deadly. Another spear of ice streaked upward, narrowly missing Regal's belly. Daenerys guided Drogon in an aerial assault from the side, blasting Viserion's flank with scalding fire. The undead dragon screeched, blackened flesh flaking. Sensing Daenerys' threat, the Night King directed Viserion into a violent spin, smashing into Drogon in midair. The 2 dragons entangled, biting and clawing, rolling through the swirling blizzard as if locked in a death spiral. On the ground, men screamed in horror as the 2 dragons crashed among them for an instant, smashing a line of whites and living soldiers alike. Drogon staggered to his feet, shaking off the daze, while Daenerys clung desperately to his harness. Viserion uncoiled, battered and scorched, undead wings beating. The Night King, perched on the creature's neck, raised his pale hand toward Daenerys. A wave of frost crackled across the earth, freezing men in place, tearing the breath from their lungs. Daenerys gasped at the surge of cold, feeling it bite into her very bones. Suddenly, Regal descended with a thunderous roar, ramming Viserion's hindquarters. The undead dragon reeled, losing balance. Drogon seized the opening, unleashing a torrent of flame that engulfed Viserion's chest and right wing. The Night King withstood the flames, but the battered corpse of the dragon beneath him convulsed in agony. Pieces of wing tore away in the firestorm, and the creature screeched a hideous lament. Then, with a last shrill cry, Viserion collapsed under the onslaught, half its body rendered to ash and bone. The Night King jumped clear, rolling across the snow in a swirl of tattered black garments. The watchers on the ridge shouted in triumph, seeing the undead dragon fall. But the battle was far from over. Whites and White Walkers still raged. Regal roared, descending to finish off the remains of Viserion, scorching what little life or unlife might be left. Daenerys, chest heaving, guided Drogon closer to the ground where the Night King stood. She intended to drown him in dragonfire. If he died, maybe the entire undead horde would collapse. "Dracarys!" she screamed, voice raw from the cold. Drogon spewed flames that melted the snow in a great arc, sending steam billowing into the air. The Night King vanished in the inferno. For a heartbeat, Daenerys dared to hope. But as the flames receded, the tall, inhuman figure still stood, ice crystals swirling around him, his flesh unscorched by the fire. His cold blue eyes locked on Daenerys, malice unbound. He lifted a new spear of ice, forming it from the frigid air. With terrible speed, he hurled it at Drogon's flank. The black dragon roared in pain, though the spear merely grazed him, lodging itself in the thick hide but not piercing a vital organ. Blood spattered across the snow. Daenerys nearly lost her seat as Drogon lurched. She spotted the Night King reaching for another weapon, a second spear forming. If he struck Drogon again, it might be mortal. From behind, Rhaegal swooped in, mouth open wide. Green fire bathed the ice-wielding fiend. But again, the flames parted around him as if repelled by an unseen force. The Night King stepped back, scanning the battlefield, as if measuring how best to deliver a final blow. On the ground, Jon realized the danger. Breaking away from the melee, caked in blood and snow, he sprinted across the field toward the Night King. Whites loomed in his path, but he cut them down with frantic slashes of long claw, ignoring the ache in his limbs. Arthur Dayne, noticing Jon's desperate charge, fought his way clear and followed, dawn flashing. They reached the perimeter of the inferno that Drogon had unleashed, steam rising in sheets. The Night King was just beyond, poised to finish Drogon or turn that deadly spear on Rhaegal. Daenerys struggled to hold onto her wounded mount, shouting at him to rise, to take flight, but Drogon was half-stunned. Jon plunged forward, roaring, "Over here!" He raised Longclaw, daring the Night King to face him. The tall figure turned, ice-blue eyes narrowing. Arthur Dayne flanked Jon, pale blade at the ready. The Night King sneered, a horrifying mimicry of a grin, and advanced, conjuring a sword of crystal from the frost. Jon attacked first, swinging Longclaw in a fierce overhead strike. The Night King parried with supernatural strength, forcing Jon back. Arthur struck from the side, hoping to catch the foe off guard. Frost exploded where dawn met the ice blade, sending shards glittering. The Night King moved with inhuman grace, weaving between them, each blow carrying lethal force. Jon reeled, barely blocking a slash that could have sheared him in half. Arthur, for all his legendary skill, found himself pressed to his limits by the creature's speed. Daenerys, seeing Jon and Arthur in mortal combat, tried to coax Drogon to launch another wave of fire, but the dragon bellowed in pain, pinned by the spear lodged in his flank. Rhaegal soared overhead, but the swirling mass of whites hindered him from swooping close. On the battlefield, thousands fought and died, the living and the dead locked in savage conflict. Jon and Arthur orchestrated a desperate pincer attack, fighting with perfect coordination. Arthur's fluid artistry complementing Jon's raw determination. The Night King, though partially encircled, moved like a specter, avoiding the worst of their strikes. Where they landed glancing blows, the ice covering his limbs cracked, but quickly reformed. His sword cut Jon's side, sending blood spraying. Jon fell to one knee, gasping. Arthur lunged, driving dawn at the Night King's chest. Steel met ice with a thunderous crack. For an instant, Arthur thought he saw a fracture run through the Night King's torso. But then the White Walker Lord twisted, grabbing the blade's edge with a bare hand. Frost erupted along the metal, creeping toward the hilt. Arthur felt the chill burrow into his bones. A savage cry tore from Jon. He mustered the last of his strength, springing up to slash at the Night King's exposed back. Longclaw bit deep, cleaving into the icy torso. A piercing wail ripped through the storm, and the Night King staggered, disoriented. Dawn broke free of his grip, trailing shards of ice. Arthur stumbled away, arms numb with cold, now bleeding a strange black ichor from the rent in his back. The Night King glared at Jon, fury incarnate. He raised an arm. Power pulsed through the air, as if he were calling forth a new wave of frost to crush them. Jon braced himself, certain he was about to die. Then Drogon, with a monumental roar, pounced. Despite his wound, the black dragon lunged forward, jaws snapping around the Night King's torso. Daenerys, still clinging to Drogon's harness, felt every tendon quiver as the dragon tore the foe from the ground. A deafening shriek echoed. Without hesitation, Daenerys shouted, "Dracarys!" And Drogon's maw erupted with flame, consuming the Night King at point-blank range. The hideous scream peaked, then abruptly cut off. The Night King's form shattered in Drogon's jaws, fragments of ice crumbling to the trampled snow. At once, A ripple passed through the battlefield. Whites collapsed, twitching, eyes extinguished. White walkers still standing disintegrated into shards of ice. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of fires, the moans of the wounded, and the gale of the wind. For a long moment no one moved. Men looked around in disbelief, weapons raised half-heartedly at whites now lying inert. The once shambling horde had simply ceased. Tyrion, trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, stood among the battered ranks of unsullied, eyes wide. Lyanna Mormont sank to her knees, tears of shock streaming down her face. The Dothraki lowered their araks, scanning for more foes that did not come. Jon, clutching his side, stumbled to where Arthur Dayne leaned on Dawn. "Are you all right?" Jon rasped. Arthur nodded numbly, though he looked pale, breath ragged. "I'll live." "You?" Jon grimaced, pressing a hand to his bleeding ribs. "I think so." His gaze flicked to where Drogon was sinking down, exhaling steam. Daenerys slid from the saddle, staggering on shaky legs. He rushed to her, ignoring the pain that flared with every step. She nearly collapsed into his arms, face streaked with ash and tears. Drogon let out a low rumble, flapping his wings once before settling painfully to the ground. "You did it," Jon whispered, voice raw. "You killed the Night King." She pressed her forehead to his shoulder, trembling. "We all did. You and Arthur, Drogon, Regal, everyone." A swirl of snow blew across the suddenly silent battlefield. The hush was eerie after such violent turmoil. Bodies littered the ground, whites and men alike. The stench of burned flesh mingled with the acrid tang of cold steel. Regal circled overhead once before landing, keening in distress at Drogon's injury. Across the field, men began to cheer in hesitant, disbelieving voices, a wave of relief and euphoria washing over them as they realized the undead truly had fallen still. Arthur Dayne, hearing the cheering, managed a faint smile. Dawn felt warm again in his grip, as though the presence of the Night King had cast a pall over everything. Tyrion limped through the snow, accompanied by Grey Worm and Tormund, approaching Jon and Daenerys. Tyrion's face was streaked with soot, a shallow cut on his forehead. "It's over," he gasped, as though barely believing his own words. "It's really over." Daenerys swayed, exhaustion threatening to take her. The army of the dead is done. If the Night King perished, the rest cannot persist. Gods be good." Her tear-filled eyes fixed on the black shape of Viserion's broken corpse in the distance, charred and collapsed. "My child is free now," she murmured, voice catching. Jon supported her, mindful of his own injuries. "We need to find the wounded, and see who else we lost." But even as he spoke, the cheering intensified. Men embraced, horses whinnied. A feeling of unbelievable deliverance swept the battered survivors. Grey Worm quietly saluted Daenerys, eyes reflecting a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. "We have victory," he said simply, in that stoic tone that once delivered only battlefield reports. Tormund spat bloody spittle in the snow. "Victory, but by the gods, what a price. The North is soaked in blood. Let's hope the living can find peace now." So the war for the dawn ended on a field of ice and fire. The living stood victorious, exhausted, grieving, but victorious. Snow continued to fall, covering the broken remains of the White Walkers and their whites, burying them as if they had never existed. In time, men would tell stories of that final stand, of dragons tearing an undead beast apart in the sky, of a Targaryen queen who risked everything to save the realm, of a hidden Targaryen king who fought side by side with her, and of a legendary knight named Arthur Dayne who swung a sword of pale fire. It took days to burn the dead, whites and men alike. The survivors formed long funeral pyres. Those who had known no family or name in life, who had traveled from Essos or the Free Folks' lands, were honored with the same rites. A hush settled over the battered camp. Among the thousands who had come, fewer than half remained to see the sunrise on the third day after the battle. Arthur Dayne, bandaged and pale from his own injuries, quietly helped gather bodies. Jon, bruised and stitched at the ribs, walked amid the funerals, offering comfort. Daenerys presided over the mass burnings, wearing a cloak to hide her trembling shoulders. She turned to him, eyes red-rimmed but calm. "I know. For all we've done, the realm remains fractured. My father's legacy, the rebellion, the countless betrayals. It all still lingers. But perhaps now, after what we've done together, we can convince the realm to unite under a better rule." She paused, swallowing. "I spoke often of breaking the wheel. This victory might give us a chance, if we use it well." Jon nodded, remembering the vow he made to protect the realm above all else. "You've more than earned your place as queen. And the North, well, the North might accept a Targaryen queen now, seeing all that you've sacrificed." She exhaled softly, searching his face. "And you? You are Targaryen as well. Some lords might see you as the rightful heir. Do we risk another conflict over who claims the throne?" Jon met her gaze, sincerity pouring from him. "I told you before, I never wanted it. I only want peace. If the realm would have me step aside for you, I would gladly do so, if it means a fair and just rule. But if the realm believes we should rule together, then perhaps we could do that." He hesitated, the words feeling too big for a battlefield's aftermath. "The days of conquest by fire and blood must end. We can begin a new era." Daenerys took his hand, the snowfall drifting around them in gentle flurries. "A new era," she repeated, her voice quiet. "If the realm sees us as hope rather than a threat, we could shape a better world." They shared a moment of profound understanding. Behind them, Grey Worm watched with a faint, respectful nod. Arthur Dayne, from a distance, saw the two Targaryens clasp hands, the burden of destiny finally shifting into something that resembled genuine partnership. He recalled the night he crowned Jon in a silent barn, the oath he took to Rhaegar, the illusions of the Mad King's reign. Now, it felt as though all that had led here, to this fragile dawn over a field once choked with death. Within the week, the battered host began a slow march south. There were wounded to carry, pyres to maintain, and many free folk who chose to remain in the far north, returning to their newly reclaimed lands. Jon and Daenerys led what was left of their combined armies, heading first to Winterfell for rest. Word spread of the victory, carried on swift ravens. The news stunned the entire realm. The undead threat had been real, and it had been defeated by the alliance of North and Targaryen. When the exhausted army finally reached Winterfell, the gates opened to them like a sanctuary. Survivors from the initial muster cheered, tears of relief shining in their eyes. The nights that followed were spent tending to the injured and burying the lost. Daenerys saw to Drogon's recovery, while Rhaegal perched watchfully atop the castle's highest tower, as though guarding them from any lingering shadow of darkness. In that lull, the question of Cersei Lannister loomed. Did they press south to dethrone her? Or would she remain behind her walls, content to rule whatever was left of the south while the Targaryens shaped a new order in the north and beyond? Jon argued for a measured approach, offering negotiations. Tyrion insisted that, if left unchecked, Cersei would eventually strike. Daenerys, tempered by loss, wanted to spare more bloodshed if possible, but she would not allow Cersei's cruelty to continue unchallenged. The invitation for peace talks was sent, and in a shocking turn, Jaime Lannister replied that he had seized command from Cersei after her betrayal became clear. She had planned to let the White Walkers destroy the Targaryens, then pick off survivors. Jaime, horrified by her willingness to doom the realm, conspired with certain loyal officers to stage a coup in King's Landing. Cersei vanished in the chaos, rumored to have fled the capital. Jaime offered the city's gates to Daenerys and Jon, requesting a formal arrangement for stable governance. Thus began a slower, more delicate campaign. Daenerys, Jon, and their key advisors decided to ride south with a smaller force, leaving the bulk of the armies to rest in the north. Winter would remain harsh for months, if not years, but at least now men need not fear the undead. Arthur Dayne accompanied them, unwavering in his oath. Tyrion traveled as well, eager to see the city that had once exiled him. The journey was marked by uneasy anticipation. Rumors placed Cersei in the Westerlands, possibly rallying loyal bannermen. Some said she had been captured by the faith militant, who held a grudge. Others claimed she sought refuge with Euron Greyjoy. Whatever the truth, Jaime remained in the capital, controlling what was left of the Lannister regime. Upon arrival, Daenerys and Jon found the city subdued, its populace exhausted by war and famine. Jaime knelt before them in the throne room of the Red Keep, offering the keys of the city. He spoke of wanting to atone for the sins he once committed in Aerys' name. Daenerys accepted his pledge with solemn grace. Jon, though uneasy about Jaime's past, recognized this as a chance to unify the kingdom. It was decided that until a formal Great Council could be called, Daenerys and Jon would rule together, stabilizing the South with minimal bloodshed. Jaime Lannister was stripped of his Golden Lion regalia but allowed to serve in the new governance, offering insight into how best to repair the devastation. Tyrion, ironically, resumed an advisory role in the city of his youth, albeit in a far more hopeful context. Weeks turned to months. The combined efforts of Targaryen loyalists, northern lords, and reformed crown officials gradually restored a semblance of order to King's Landing. Daenerys issued decrees banning slavery outright in the Seven Kingdoms, reaffirming the freedman's status from the wars in Slaver's Bay. Jon worked with Arthur Dayne to ensure the city's defenses were restructured to rely less on cruelty and intimidation. The City Watch was purged of corruption, replaced with men who swore loyalty to the realm rather than any single house. The small folk, though wary of dragons, slowly came to appreciate the new, gentler order taking hold. Beyond the capital, the rest of Westeros reeled from the news that winter might last for years, but the undead were destroyed. Word of the Targaryen-Stark union, two monarchs, each with a rightful claim, spread like wildfire. Some balked at a divided monarchy. Others, reeling from the horrors of war, welcomed the arrangement. The Lords of Dorne, the Vale, and the Reach dispatched envoys to treat with the new government, each hoping to secure favored status in a realm that had known only instability for so long. It was in this atmosphere of cautious hope that Daenerys and Jon were finally crowned in the ruins of the Dragon Pit, the same place that had once hosted the harrowing demonstration of the White. Nobles from every corner of the realm gathered, uncertain but curious. The day was cold, but the sky was startlingly clear, as though the realm itself felt relief from the vanquished darkness. Rhaegal circled overhead, Drogon perched on a distant tower, each living symbol of House Targaryen's return. With Tyrion officiating in a half-serious, half-wry tone, he had never imagined himself a master of ceremonies. Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Targaryen were crowned as joint rulers. She is Queen of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, with her seat in the Red Keep. He is King of the North and co-ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, bridging the old feuds that once tore them apart. In truth, their arrangement was still fluid, subject to negotiation with each lord who arrived. But in that moment, the realm glimpsed a possibility of unity under ice and fire intertwined. Arthur Dayne stood by, watching with a mixture of pride and profound relief. He had upheld his vow to Rhaegar, protected the prince who would be king. He had seen the darkest threat to the realm undone, fighting side by side with men and women from every corner of Westeros. As the cheers rose in the Dragon Pit, hesitant at first, then swelling as lords and small folk alike accepted the new order, Arthur felt a weight lift from his heart. Dawn, sheathed at his hip, seemed to hum with silent satisfaction. When the final oath had been spoken, Jon and Daenerys turned, facing the crowd. The hush that fell was charged with anticipation. Daenerys, her silver-gold hair braided with small dragonbone ornaments, wore a half-smile, the weight of the new crown pressing on her brow. Jon, clad in dark leathers and the cloak of a king in the north, but now bearing the Targaryen sigil alongside the Stark direwolf, looked out at the gathering with humble determination. They had survived impossible trials, lost loved ones, and saved the realm from an enemy beyond mortal comprehension. Now came the harder task, forging a realm that would not devour itself anew. Daenerys stepped forward to speak, voice carrying across the ancient stones. She spoke of the hardships endured, the bravery of the living, the sorrow of war. She spoke of how dragons and wolves had united, how she and Jon would strive to break the cycle of bloodshed that had defined the realm. Then Jon added his voice, a quieter but resolute cadence, reminding all that the threat of winter was not just the undead, but famine and cruelty. He promised the North would not stand apart if the rest of the realm needed aid, so long as the realm offered the same care to the North. When they finished, the applause surged. It was not the raucous cheer of conquering armies, but a heartfelt, almost tearful wave of hope from weary men and women who had seen too much horror. Tyrion wiped at his eyes surreptitiously. Grey Worm stood stoically, arms folded, though a flicker of pride shone in his gaze. Ser Davos muttered a prayer of thanks to whichever gods might be listening. Lyanna Mormont, near the front of the stands, nodded in approval as though to say, "About time." Afterward, in the shadow of the dragon pit, Arthur Dayne made his way to Jon and Daenerys, who were greeting well-wishers. He bowed, placing a hand over his heart. "Your graces," he said softly. "You have restored House Targaryen, saved the realm from darkness, and united North and South in a way not seen since Aegon's conquest. I am proud to have served you." Jon clasped Arthur's arm in a soldier's grip. "Ser Arthur, your guidance made all this possible. I can never repay the debt." Daenerys, touched by the knight's sincerity, rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You carried Rhaegar's last hope into the future, and you helped me keep my faith when all seemed lost. The realm owes you a greater debt than you know." Arthur inclined his head, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "For so long, I feared I had failed Rhaegar, but I see now that his dream lives on, not in madness or tyranny, but in justice and hope. I thank you both for vindicating his memory." Jon exchanged a glance with Daenerys. She gave a subtle nod, and Jon turned back to Arthur. "Ser Arthur Dayne, Sword of the Morning, will you continue to serve? We would have you as Lord Commander of a new Kingsguard, or Queensguard, if you will. Your loyalty and honor would guide a new generation." Arthur hesitated, eyes clouding with emotion. "I am old, though perhaps not so old as some. My bones ache from years of war. Yet, if it is your wish, I'll serve until I can serve no more." Daenerys extended her hand, expression warm. "Then rise, Lord Commander Dayne, sworn sword to the crown of the Seven Kingdoms. We will need your wisdom as the realm moves forward." He sank to one knee, head bowed, the final act of a vow begun decades ago. When he rose, cheers rose with him. Knights from across the realm, seeing the storied figure of Arthur Dayne honored, murmured in approval. Tyrion smirked, leaning towards Ser Davos. "Now that's a Kingsguard worth having," he quipped. Davos only nodded, eyes reflecting the swirl of gratitude and awe. In the weeks that followed, the newly crowned pair began the painstaking process of forging peace. Lands ravaged by war and famine required healing. The North, battered by the White Walkers, needed seeds and supplies for the extended winter. The Riverlands, so often the battleground of every conflict, cried out for relief. Dorne, the Vale, and the Reach each negotiated their terms in King's Landing, some pressing for independence, others satisfied with reduced taxes or local autonomy. Slowly, a patchwork consensus emerged. The question of Cersei Lannister's whereabouts still loomed, but rumors placed her in a distant part of the Westerlands with a handful of loyalists. Some said she died on the road. Others claimed she planned a vengeful return. Yet as the months wore on with no sign of her, the realm's focus shifted from fear of the old queen to hope for the new monarchy. Jaime Lannister kept a careful watch, regret etched in his every move, but he pledged to serve as a cautious mediator for the Lannister bannermen to ensure no further rebellion. Daenerys worked tirelessly to reform the capital's governance, guided by Tyrion's cunning and Missandei's measured counsel. Jon traveled frequently between King's Landing and Winterfell, ensuring the North's needs were not forgotten. Each time he arrived, the people hailed him as a king who had fought in the snows to save them. The scars on his side reminded him daily of that final stand against the Night King. The realm might never truly understand the depth of that horror, but they knew enough to respect the sacrifice. Even the faith of the Seven began to reconcile with the presence of dragons, seeing them now as saviors rather than instruments of tyranny. The High Septon declared that the long night had been a divine trial, cleansed by the union of Targaryen fire and northern resolve. Quietly, the old controversies about Rhaegar's marriage to Lyanna Stark faded in the face of the living heirs who carried both lines to new heights. In time, Daenerys and Jon began to formalize the question of succession, a matter neither had wanted to contemplate during the war. If they ruled jointly, would their children inherit the throne as Targaryens, or would the North remain separate? Counselors debated for months, but eventually, a compromise was reached. The child or children of Jon and Daenerys, should they have any, would be recognized as the rightful heirs to both the Iron Throne and the North, pending the Northern Lord's approval. A great council in Harrenhal ratified it, marking the first time all the great houses recognized a single lineage that united Stark and Targaryen. So the seasons rolled on, the realm healing in fits and starts. Hunger remained a concern, but trade routes reopened. The city's crumbling infrastructure was slowly rebuilt. Dothraki roamed the riverlands, eventually integrating or returning to Essos at Daenerys' invitation. The Unsullied, many of whom had no home to return to, settled near the Blackwater, forming a disciplined guard that protected travelers from brigands. The ghost of war still lingered, but each day, a small step was taken toward stability. Through it all, Arthur Dayne served with unwavering devotion. As Lord Commander, he recruited knights of unimpeachable character, forging a new White Cloak order that learned from the mistakes of the past. Where once the Kingsguard had been used to enforce a mad king's will, now they stood as protectors of the people as much as the monarchs. Arthur's presence, gray streaking his hair, reminded Westeros of an older code of honor, a code revived under the Targaryen Stark rule. Years later, songs would be written of that final victory over the Night King, of the heartbreak and the triumph, the forging of an unprecedented alliance. The young would hear ballads telling how dragons soared against an undead dragon in a sky of swirling snow, how a hidden prince from the north revealed himself to be the rightful heir, how a queen from across the sea gave everything to protect the realm she had never known. And at the heart of these tales, Arthur Dayne shone, the knight who survived beyond his time to crown the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna, who stood at his side in the greatest battle of an age, and who helped guide the newborn realm to a fragile but lasting peace. In the twilight of his life, Arthur sometimes visited the godswood in Winterfell, where the old weirwood stood silent vigil. There he would reflect on the swirling events that had shaped his destiny, recalling the dusty dunes of Dorne, the locked tower where Lyanna Stark had died, and the day he knelt to crown Jon Targaryen in secret. He would remember the heartbreak of losing Rhaegar, the improbable triumph on the frozen battlefield, and the new dawn that followed. Often, he would bow his head and say a quiet thanks to the old gods and the new, certain that somewhere, Rhaegar and Lyanna smiled to see their son, and the realm they'd shaped, finally at peace. And so, in a way, the story ended as it began, with a promise. But unlike that desperate oath whispered in the Tower of Joy, "Protect him, Arthur. Keep him safe," this final promise was one of hope. A realm once broken by war had found renewal in the union of ice and fire, guided by the devotion of a legendary knight who refused to let the last Targaryen heir fade into darkness. In that promise, Westeros found a chance to break free from the old cycles, to heal the scars of centuries of strife, and to look upon the sunrise without fear of what lay beyond the wall. For the first time in living memory, the living need not dread the shadows. The dawn had come at last,